where a tent costs $47 at Walmart. A straw bale costs 3. That's the whole story, in a way. But the story isn't really about the money. Della Marsh was 24 years old the winter she started building. She'd been living behind the AutoZone warehouse on Gibson Boulevard in Albuquerque for about 8 months. Not in the warehouse, not near it exactly. Just in the scrub lot behind it, where the chain link fence had rusted through in one corner and nobody had fixed it. The lot was ugly, sand and broken asphalt, and a few dead chamisa shrubs that rattled in the wind. It wasn't invisible, but it was ignored, which is almost the same thing if you're careful about it. She had a tent, after she'd had 2 tents before that one. The first one she'd left behind when she moved on from Tucson. The second one lasted 11 months before the seams gave out in a rainstorm and the whole thing went soft and useless in about 40 minutes. The third tent, the Walmart one, the $47 one, was still standing the morning she dragged the first straw bale across the lot. But it was cold. The tent held your body heat for maybe an hour after you stopped moving, and then it just became a slightly more private version of being outside. She was cold all the time that winter. Not dangerously cold, she knew the difference by then, but the slow grinding kind of cold that sits in your joints and makes you smaller. She'd wake up at 4 in the morning and lie still because moving made it worse before it made it better. What changed things was Marcus. Marcus Okafor ran a small construction supply salvage yard about 6 blocks from the AutoZone lot. He was 61 years old, originally from Lagos, and he had been buying and reselling surplus building materials in Albuquerque for 18 years. He knew the neighborhood the way someone who's watched it change knows it, not nostalgically, just accurately. He'd seen 3 tent cities come and go on the empty lots between Gibson and the rail yard. He'd seen people move through, stay, disappear. He wasn't sentimental about any of it, but he was practical, and practical people notice things. He noticed Della because she came by his yard twice in 1 week looking for scrap wood. Not begging, not asking for handouts. Or she had $12 and she wanted to know what $12 would get her. The first time, he sold her 3 warped 2x4s for $4. The second time, she came back and asked specifically if he had anything she could use to insulate a small structure. She had a notepad and she'd written things down. Marcus looked at the notepad. He looked at her. He asked what she was building. She said she wasn't sure yet, but she knew cold air was her main problem, and she knew mass and insulation were the answer. And she'd been reading about straw bale construction on her phone at the library, and she wanted to know if it was actually as cheap as it seemed, or if there was something she was missing. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There's always something you're missing, but straw bale isn't wrong." That was how it started. Their straw bale construction has been around for over 100 years in the American Southwest. It showed up in the late 1800s in Nebraska and the Sandhills region, when settlers needed to build fast and had almost nothing to build with. The prairie didn't offer timber. What it offered was grass and wheat, and the dried stalks left after harvest, baled by the new baling machines and stacked into walls because walls were what people needed and bales were what they had. Those original buildings are still standing in some parts of Nebraska. That's not a metaphor, that's just a fact. The oldest surviving straw bale structure in the United States is over 100 years old. The walls are thick, usually 18 inches or more, and that thickness is where the insulation lives. The R value of a straw bale wall is higher than most modern framed walls with standard insulation. It holds heat, it holds cool, it's quiet. Della knew most of this from her phone. What she didn't know yet was how to make it work with almost no tools, almost no money, and no help except an old man who gave her advice across a chain-link fence. She wasn't building a house. She was building a room. One room, roughly 8 feet by 10 feet, with enough interior height that she could stand up straight. She had her tent already. She was going to disassemble the tent and use part of the fabric as a ground cover and moisture barrier. The bales would be the walls. She needed a roof, and she needed a way to keep the bales from migrating or sagging over time. And she needed to do all of this without power tools, without a vehicle, and without drawing attention to herself on a lot that was technically not hers to build on. The first question she asked Mark is how many bales. He did the rough math with her. For a structure that size, single bale width on each wall, she needed somewhere between 32 and 40 bales depending on how she handled the corners and openings. He told her she'd lose heat at the corners no matter what, so she should plan for it rather than fight it. She had no idea how to get 40 bales to the lot. He told her where to look. Not the big farm supply places. Those ran $7 to $9 a bale, which was more than she could manage. But farmers on the edge of the metro, people with horses or small operations, often had damaged or weathered bales they couldn't sell into feed. They'd let them go for almost nothing, sometimes free if you could take them away. She spent 3 days on her phone calling numbers from a Craigslist search and from a board at the feed co-op near the fairgrounds. Most people didn't answer. 3 said they only sold in large quantities. One man in Bernalillo said he had 14 bales she could have for $10 total if she could pick them up that weekend. She didn't have a truck. She didn't have a car. She borrowed a shopping cart from behind a grocery store. 4 blocks away, she lined it with a torn tarp she'd found near the rail yard. Then she found a second cart. She zip-tied them together at the handles, imperfectly, impractically, in a way that made them list to one side, and she walked 6 blocks to the AutoZone lot and parked them behind the rusted fence. Then she called the man in Bernalillo back and told him she'd need a few trips. He laughed. Not cruelly, more the way someone laughs when they're surprised. He asked how she was planning to get up there. She said the bus got close enough and she'd figure out the last mile. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said he'd bring the first load to her if she paid the $10 up front. He came down on a Saturday morning in a flatbed truck with the 14 bales and 2 of his grandkids who thought the whole thing was hilarious. They helped her unload. She gave him the $10 in ones and fives. She went back to Craigslist. She found a woman with a small horse operation near Rio Rancho who had 11 bales that had gotten wet on one side. Della said she'd take them. The woman said she could have them for free if she loaded them herself. Della found a man at the day labor corner on Central who was willing to do 2 hours of work for $8. His name was Terrence, and he had a bad back, but he was strong, and he knew how to stack. They got a ride from someone at the lot, a man named Paul who had a pickup and occasionally helped people move things in exchange for gas money. And they got the 11 bales loaded and brought back to Gibson in one trip. That gave her 25 bales. She needed at least 32. She found 7 more over the following 2 weeks. 3 came from a farm in Corrales. 4 came from a church near the university that had used them as fall decorations and hadn't figured out how to dispose of them. The church ones were small and not as tightly bound, but Marcus told her she could use them to fill gaps rather than as primary structure. And that's what she did. By the time she had enough bales, the temperature had dropped to the mid-20s at night. She was still in the tent. She was still cold. The building took 9 days. It is worth saying plainly what that means. 9 days of physical work done by one person in her mid-20s, with no power tools on a gravel lot in November in weather that got to 22 degrees on 2 of those nights. She stacked the bales in a running bond pattern, the same way you'd laid bricks, each row offset from the one below it so the joints don't line up. Marcus had told her that. He'd also told her to drive rebar stakes through the bales vertically every few feet to keep them from shifting. She didn't have rebar. She found a hardware store selling bent and rejected rebar from a road project for $1 a piece, and she bought 14 pieces with money she'd saved from aluminum cans. The corners were the hardest part. Straw bale corners require the bales to be notched or interlocked. Otherwise, the wall wants to push outward at the joint. She didn't have a saw. She had a large bread knife she'd found at a thrift store for 50 cents, and she used it to cut and shape the corner bales by hand. This took most of one full day. Her hands were raw at the end of it. The roof was a problem she'd known about from the beginning. Straw bale walls can't support a heavy load without a proper bond beam, a structural cap that distributes weight across the top of the wall. She didn't have the materials or the knowledge to build one correctly, so she didn't put a heavy roof on it. She built what Marcus called a modified lean-to, a simple angled frame made from the warped 2x4s she'd bought from him, plus 6 more pieces of wood she found in the lot over time. The frame leaned against the tallest wall and sloped down to the shortest. Over the frame, she put a layer of heavy contractor plastic sheeting, the kind that comes in rolls for painting, which she got from a dumpster behind a construction site. Over the plastic, she put a layer of corrugated metal roofing she'd salvaged from a demolished structure, 2 lots over. It wasn't beautiful. When she stood back and looked at it, it looked like what it was. A rough structure built by someone with not enough money and not enough tools, but enough time and enough stubbornness. The walls were uneven. One corner sat slightly lower than the others. The roof overhang on the south side was longer than the north because she ran out of material, but it was standing. She cut a door opening in the south-facing wall, 3 bales wide, 2 stacks high, and framed it with a pair of pallets she'd broken apart and reassembled into rough door jambs. For the door itself, She used a sheet of plywood she'd found on the lot the first week, hinged to the jamb, with 3 offset mount hinges she bought for $1.40 at a salvage store. The first night she slept inside it, the temperature outside dropped to 19 degrees. Inside, without any additional heat source, the temperature stayed at 41. That is not warm. 41 degrees is still cold, but it is 22 degrees warmer than the air outside. And that difference, held by the walls, held by the mass of all that straw, is the difference between sleeping and not sleeping. Here's what most people don't know about straw bale construction, and this is where it gets interesting. The information exists, you can find it, but it's written almost entirely for people who own land, have permits, have contractors, have time. There's a whole community of owner-builders and sustainable architecture enthusiasts who've been writing about this stuff for 30 years. Books, journals, websites, courses you can take, workshops in Taos and Santa Fe where you pay a few $100s to spend a weekend learning to plaster straw bale walls. None of that is aimed at someone sleeping in a tent in Albuquerque with $37 to her name. Della figured out what she needed from the library's internet terminals, and from Marcus. She spent a lot of time on library internet. She'd go in the mornings before the afternoon rush, and she'd read and take notes and ask the librarian, a woman named Janet who seemed utterly unbothered by the range of research requests she received, for help finding specific things. Janet got her access to a construction textbook through interlibrary loan. She also helped her find a PDF of an old New Mexico owner-builder guide from the 1990s that had a chapter on earthen and straw construction. What Della was finding out, piece by piece, was that she'd done most of it right. The running bond was right. The south-facing door was right. Passive solar, even at her scale, made a measurable difference. The moisture barrier under the floor was right. What she was missing was a plaster coat on the exterior walls. Straw bale walls need protection from the elements, traditionally an earthen or lime plaster that seals the surface and sheds water. She couldn't do lime plaster without buying materials she couldn't afford. But she could do earthen plaster. An earthen plaster in New Mexico costs almost nothing because the soil in much of the region already has the right clay content. She tested her lot soil the way the book described. Fill a jar with soil and water, shake it, let it sit for 2 hours, and look at the layers that form. Sand settles fast. Clay stays suspended and settles slowly on top. You want roughly 30% clay content for plaster. Her soil tested around 25%. Close enough to work with if she added a small amount of the commercial powdered clay she found at a pottery supply store for $4 a pound. She bought 2 pounds. She spent 4 days plastering. The mix was soil, clay, water, and chopped straw. Straw she pulled off the loose bales and cut into short lengths with the bread knife. The plaster went on with her hands and a piece of board she used as a float. It was slow. Her back hurt. The plaster cracked in some places as it dried, and she went back and refilled the cracks and let it dry again. When it was done, the structure looked different, smoother, more intentional, less like a temporary thing and more like a thing that meant to be there. People noticed. The lot had a rough constituency, a shifting mix of people who passed through, people who stayed for a week or a month, people who'd been there for years in their own configurations of tarps and tents and cardboard. Della had mostly kept to herself. She wasn't unfriendly, but she was private, and the lot had its own social geometry that she'd learned to navigate without friction. When the structure went up, people looked at it. Some people laughed, not all of them, but some. A few guys who'd been camping near the fence on the north side called it a haystack. One of them, a man in his 30s named Drago, who'd been there since before Della arrived, walked over one afternoon and stood outside the door opening and said, "What happens when it rains?" She told him what happened when it rained. The metal roof sheds water, the plaster sheds water, and the interior stays dry. He looked skeptical. He said straw goes moldy. She told him straw goes moldy when it stays wet. Properly plastered straw bale walls don't stay wet. The vapor barrier under the floor prevents ground moisture from wicking up. The roof overhang protects the top of the walls. He said, "Okay." He didn't come back to argue, but he watched. The first real rain came about 3 weeks after she finished. 2 days of intermittent rain. The second day heavier, she was inside during most of it. She had a small oil lantern she'd found at an estate sale, the kind that runs on lamp oil, not propane, and she had 2 wool blankets she'd gotten from a church distribution, and she was dry, and she was warm enough, and the walls around her were quiet, in a way that the tent had never been. When the rain stopped, Drago walked over. He looked at the walls. He pressed his hand against the plaster. He looked at the roof joint where the corrugated metal met the wall. He walked around the full perimeter without saying anything. Then he said, "I want to build one." That was November. By January, 3 other people on the lot had started their own versions of the structure. Not copies. Each one was different, adapted to the materials available and the space the person had and what they could manage physically. An older woman named Peg, who'd been living behind the fence for 2 years, built a smaller version, maybe 6 by 8 feet, with walls only 1 bale thick. A younger man named Colton, who'd grown up doing construction in his family's contracting business, built a more technically sophisticated version, with a proper bond beam made from 2 by 8s he'd sourced from a remodeling job site. He did it fast, in about 5 days. His walls were straighter than Della's, his corners were cleaner. The structure that surprised everyone was Drago's. He built it over the course of 6 weeks, working methodically, changing his plan 3 times as he went. He was from Bosnia originally, and he'd grown up doing things with his hands. Not construction exactly, but fix-it work, the kind of adaptive repair you do when parts aren't available and you have to make things work from what you have. He understood structure intuitively, in a way that Della, working from text, had to think through carefully. What he added to her basic model was a thermal mass interior wall, a narrow inner wall built not from straw, but from rammed earth inside old grain bags. He'd seen it in a book maybe, or maybe he just reasoned it out. The rammed earth wall inside the straw bale outer wall created a thermal battery. The straw insulated, the earth stored heat. The two materials worked together in a way that either alone doesn't fully achieve. During the day, whatever heat entered the space was absorbed by the earth wall. At night, the earth wall released it slowly. His structure stayed warmer than any of the others. Della went inside it one evening and sat down on the dirt floor and just stayed there for a while. She said later that it was the first time she'd been genuinely comfortable. Not just tolerable, but comfortable, since before she'd left Tucson. What she'd hidden inside her shelter, the thing that took weeks for anyone to notice, wasn't a secret exactly. It was just small, and it was hers, and she hadn't explained it to anyone. In the back corner of her structure, tucked against the wall where the insulation was thickest, she'd built a shelf out of 2 pieces of pallet wood. On the shelf was a small collection of things, a waterproof journal she'd been keeping since leaving Tucson, a tin box with her documents inside, ID, birth certificate, a folded paper with her sister's address in Flagstaff, a small portable battery bank she'd saved up for and bought at a pawn shop for $11, and a hand mirror. None of this sounds significant, but the journal is what people eventually asked about. She'd been writing in it for almost 2 years. Not a diary exactly, more like notes, observations, things she'd figured out, things she wanted to remember. She wrote about the straw bale construction in there, the whole process, in enough detail that someone else could follow it. She wrote about the soil test, and the plaster, and the corner problem, and the roof. She wrote about Marcus and what he'd told her. She wrote about Drago's rammed earth wall when she understood what he'd done. Peg found out about the journal when she asked Della to help troubleshoot a moisture problem in her own structure. Della pulled out the journal and flipped to the section on moisture barriers and read to her from it. Peg looked at her and said, "You wrote all that down?" Della said yes. Peg said, "Can I read it?" She handed it over. Peg read it for about an hour, sitting on the floor of Della's shelter with the oil lantern lit, turning pages. When she handed it back, she said, "Someone should type this up." Dr. Colton had a phone with a keyboard, and too much time in the weeks after he finished his structure. He offered. Della thought about it for about 4 days before she said yes. He typed the whole thing into a Google Doc over the course of a week, working from the journal and asking her questions when her handwriting was unclear, or when she'd written shorthand she needed to explain. He added his own notes in brackets, things he'd done differently, things he'd learned from doing the bond beam correctly. Drago added a section about the rammed earth interior wall. He dictated it, and Colton typed it. The document was 41 pages. Colton posted it to a Reddit thread about alternative housing. He titled it, "Straw Bale Shelter Construction with No Tools and No Budget. Notes from Albuquerque." He put Della's name on it as the primary author with a note that 2 other contributors had added sections. Within a week, the post had tens of thousands of views. People in the sustainable building community shared it. People in housing advocacy circles shared it. Someone sent it to a professor at UNM who taught an architecture course with a vernacular construction unit, and the professor put it in the reading list for his students the following semester. Marcus found out about it because one of his regular customers came by the yard and mentioned it. He called Della on the prepaid phone she'd gotten in the fall and told her. She was quiet on the phone for a moment. Then she asked if people had found mistakes. He said yes. A few people in the comments had pointed out that her moisture vapor barrier recommendation was incomplete for certain climates, and that her rebar spacing was on the minimum end for seismic zones. She said she'd update it. She went to the library the next morning and asked Janet to help her access the document. She read all the comments. She took notes. She revised the document in 2 sessions, fixing the moisture section and adding a note about seismic considerations with a reference to the New Mexico state guidelines. Then she went back to the lot and she told Drago and Colton what she'd changed and why. There is a version of this story where it ends with something big, a nonprofit, a grant, a television segment. Those things may happen, they may not. The story doesn't really live in what might happen. It lives in what was already there. 40 bales of straw, $3 each for most of them, some of them free. A bread knife, 2 shopping carts zip-tied together, 14 bent rebar stakes at $1 each, $8 of day labor for 2 hours, $11 for a used battery bank, $4 a pound for 2 pounds of powdered clay, a 41-page document that came from a waterproof journal that came from 2 years of paying attention. Total cost of the structure. Della calculated it afterward. Materials only, not counting the labor, which was her own. She got to $112. That included the rebar, the plywood door, the hinges, the lamp oil for the lantern for the first 3 months, and the clay. A tent costs $47 and doesn't hold heat. A straw bale structure costs $112 and holds it long enough to sleep. That's what she hid inside the haystack everyone laughed at. Not a secret, not a surprise, not a trick. A shelf, a journal, everything she'd learned, written down so she wouldn't forget it, and so someone else wouldn't have to start from nothing. Or she's still on the Gibson lot. The structure is still standing. Doctorow planted chamisa in the plaster cracks on the south wall last spring, and it's growing, which means the plaster has enough moisture to support it without becoming structurally compromised, which is, technically, exactly what you'd want.